what the other speakers would be presenting. So what I'm actually going to be talking about a little bit here are some of the issues that came up, at least in the Disputatio session, but also I think in a number of our talks, in fact all of them, where we've come to the whole question of morality, right? What it means to be human. And a lot of that was related to the question of artificial intelligence through Jordan's talk. I'd like to relate it to human origins. And I just want to make a commercial here. Based on what I said on Monday, you're probably not going to be surprised to hear that I think that the evolution of human beings should be a part of the high school curriculum. From a faith perspective, it is one of the places that is least fully kind of lit or engaged by Catholics when they talk about faith and science. It tends to be an area where there's a lot of media coverage. So, I mean, we found in just the last 10 years, they found 8 new hominid species, right? So, I mean, that, and that might be a, you know, or I think that's right, but several at least, if not more. So, and every time that comes out, students, the question in their mind raises, what am I in relation to this, right? If this is an ancestor of mine or related to me, what does that mean? And so this talk is about trying to answer that question the best that I can and hopefully raise some discussion about it as we move on with the panel. So to preface, I want to start with this. In 2002, a discovery was made in a South African cave that is widely regarded as one of the most important finds of all time for understanding the when and where of human beginnings, the advent of our species. 2 pieces of engraved ochre, dating back 75 to 100,000 years ago, were discovered by archaeologist Christopher Henselwood and his team. They bore crosshatch patterns, as you can see, with parallel incised lines. They are the oldest known examples of human artifacts that can confidently be interpreted as symbolic. Although no one can tell if they are the first ever, what seems clear is that the humans at Blambos Cave existed on our side of the cognitive breakthrough, sometimes referred to as the human revolution, the emergence of symbolic thought, the ability to organize the world around us mentally by generating a vast array of symbols in which one thing stands for another. The word symbol actually comes from the Greek word symboline, which means to put together. And in Blambos Cave, a design is given that shows up in later artifacts and seems to be put together with, or to stand for, some referent that must remain mysterious to us. We don't know what the symbolism means. Regardless of the unknown referent, the significance of the Blambos ochre remains, because symbolism is at the heart of the difference between animal communication, like bird song, on the one hand, and human language on the other, between the skillful problem solving of chimps and human reflection upon the intrinsic nature of things, even upon our own consciousness, as we saw yesterday in Jeremy's talk. Between personal ornamentation and artistic expression, between intelligence and abstract conceptualization and reason. In symbolic thought, we have reached the threshold of the human difference, recognizably distinguishing us from the other animals, even our hominin ancestors. Other animals may act intelligently and make natural judgments, as I mentioned on Monday, but we human animals have the power of reason, the ability to capture some aspect of a thing in an abstract concept or symbol, and to then reason with respect to it, to develop a deeper comprehension of both it and how it relates to other things. And it may well have been, in some place like Blambos Cave, that the first glimmerings of rationality, of reason, can be spotted amid the sediments of prehistory. One of the reasons that teachers of religion, and also teachers in Catholic schools, are wary of this topic is because it seems that for Catholics, the one thing that any kind of investigation of human origins can give us is some moment or instance of the difference between humans and other animals, right? boiling it down to the genetic difference, say, between a guy named Adam and his non-symbolic, non-linguistic parents, right? And for many, this is a task on which hangs the very integrity of the Christian faith. Many people think, and I get asked about Adam and Eve all the time when I give talks, that without a clearly defined moment of a well-explained biological change involving just one female and one male, we have to put brackets around salvation history. Since salvation history, they think, hangs on the coattails of the existence and guilt of a single pair of first human persons. The assumption is nearly always that once we have sufficiently established a biological transition to the human species, evolutionary science has finished its service to theology. Once we find that, we simply posit preternatural gifts, original innocence, and then, following that, deliberately committed moral evil at our origins. And we have done the work necessary to understand all that follows, from Abraham through incarnation to Pentecost and the church. Just 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, I guess now, New Advent. How many of you are familiar with New Advent? It's kind of a collection of blogs and news articles and stuff about Catholicism. New Advent featured an article entitled Adam, Eve, and Insights from Anthropology. In it, the anonymous blogger, the Axe apologist, he calls himself, began by claiming the following. Let's leave that right there. The Christian faith is sometimes called a historical religion. This means it isn't just a philosophy of life. It makes claims about world history, claims which need to be true for its teachings to have any merit. Among these are the creation of the universe, the resurrection of Jesus, and a real Adam and Eve. Now, the first three sentences, I think, are undeniably true, and certainly the resurrection of Christ is an historical event. But if you've been to other Foundations events, and most of you have, we encounter an error in the first item in the list given in the final sentence. Creation is not a claim about world history. It's a claim about the relation of all things to God, right? Who holds them in existence at every moment. Right now, God is saying, let there be light, right? Right now, God is saying, let us form humanity in our image, after our likeness. But the final item, a real Adam and Eve, I think is not a fully developed understanding of biblical symbolism, of magisterial teaching, or of human evolution. I think it is not a fully developed understanding of biblical symbolism, because when you have an ancient Near Eastern narrative in which a male whose name means earth marries a woman whose name means life, you should be looking for a deeper meaning and recognize that the details are a window into that deeper meaning. It is an impoverished view of magisterial teaching because it takes a caution given by Pope Pius XII 70 years ago, as if it is infallible dogma for all time, instead of the wise caution of Mother Church in the face of new and untested scientific ideas. And finally, it is an impoverished view of human evolution because it proposes for our species a biological scenario that is not at all reflective of how evolution works, which is in changes in populations, not in a couple of individuals. Our faith is not wedded, my point here is, to a model that envisions the transmission of original sin as something sexual, genetic, like a deleterious gene mutation, but as, and we're going to see in a little while, but as relational damage. And whatever tragic event happened, right, whether it involved many more humans than two, it is true, right, that humanity is damaged in our relationships deeply. It's the responsibility of theologians and philosophers to reflect upon how our new knowledge of human origins requires us to reframe our speculations in such a way that no element of the dogma of original sin is obscured. And I think it's the duty of catechists and religion teachers to help dial back the rhetoric of axe apologists and show the faithful, especially the young faithful, that there's room for development in the church's understanding of how original sin affects the whole human race. But back to Blambos Cave. The deeper theological question about human origins that I think gets obscured by anxiety about Adam and Eve is this one. Does that which distinguishes us from the other animals and even the other hominins, I mean, you can pick one, our DNA, our symbolism, language, reason, is that sufficient to get at the heart of what it means to be human? The theological answer to this question, the answer of faith, is no. What distinguishes us from the other animals, that which makes us rational animals, is a necessary start to being human and is part of any answer to the question of human nature understood theologically. But the heart of being human lies further up and further in. In this regard, consider another discovery about humanity from around 110 AD. At that time, St. Ignatius of Antioch, a bishop from the Holy Land, made his way to Rome under escort of Roman soldiers, a prisoner on his way to martyrdom, writing letters to the various Christian communities along his route. He also wrote ahead to the church in Rome and made an urgent appeal to the Christians there not to attempt to avert his execution. This is what he said: "I am God's wheat, and shall be ground by the teeth of wild animals. I am writing to all the churches to let it be known that I will gladly die for God, if only you do not stand in my way. I plead with you, show me no untimely kindness. Let me be food for the wild beasts, for they are my way to God." And then he makes a startling claim: "The time for my birth is close at hand. Forgive me, my brothers. Do not stand in the way of my birth to real life. Do not wish me stillborn. My desire is to belong to God. Only on my arrival there can I be fully a human being." Here we have a Christian martyr and saint bearing all the telling capacities of a rational animal, writing letters, using symbolism expressed in the metaphor of being wheat, for example, who openly professes that he is not yet fully a human being, that somehow his cruel death will be a process by which he will actually become human. He knows himself to be human already, but not yet fully. And he goes even to the point of saying that he still needs to be born. Something about his death will make him belong to God. And only in belonging to God will he become human without further qualification. And it is the nature of his death that provides him hope, because it resembles the death of one who was born not in Blambos cave, but in a cave in Bethlehem. The life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ, out of witness to whom Ignatius would offer his life, is what it means to be a human being, without any further qualification. As St. Paul says in Romans chapter 5, verse 13, Adam was a type of the one who was to come. He was a prefiguration of a new and greater Adam, possessing everything that the first Adam has, but fulfilling it in a new and greater way. Today I want to expound upon the significance of Christ as the one who truly reveals what it means to be human, who offers the greatest insight to all who want to understand human nature. First, I'll reflect on human nature as understood in light of evolutionary psychology and related sciences. From these, we learn that all human inclinations and tendencies are morally ambiguous. Regardless of their potential for leading us toward moral good, they also quite naturally incline us toward moral evil. St. Paul captured this tragic paradox perfectly as he lamented his own life experience in his letter to the Romans, chapter 7, verse 19 through 20. "What I do not understand. For I do not do what I want, but I do what I hate. The will to be good is ready, but doing the good is not. For I do not do the good I want, but I do the evil I do not want." Second, I'll go back and revisit some things I talked about briefly, though I'll revisit them briefly, about St. Thomas Aquinas and understanding or interpreting this moral ambiguity. As we've already seen, Thomas stands out among his contemporaries for taking human animality very seriously. Of course, I can't say whether or not I'm absolutely right about this, but I guess he would have enjoyed Matt Rosano's talk. Yeah, right. Finally, I'll turn to sacred scripture and tradition to consider the overarching answer of the Christian faith to the moral ambiguity of human nature as we experience it and as it manifests itself in human history. We have already encountered that answer dramatically in the person of Ignatius of Antioch, but here I'll try to offer a theological rationale for this assertion as it is embodied in a feast we will celebrate just 2 days from now, the Feast of the Sacred Heart of Jesus. And as a postscript, I'll offer an example of a saint who embodies what I think we could call the deepest theological human difference, whose union with Christ compellingly reveals what is possible for human beings. Okay, so first, to human nature as understood by science. In the disconnected jumble, hold on one second here, of the media's standard popular science interpretation, even in educational programming, human beings are either castigated as the descendants of killer apes or championed as the peace-loving descendants of gracile, mostly vegetarian Australopiths. One report will suggest that we're hopelessly violent. The next, that peaceful cooperation and altruism are the natural predispositions of humans from our beginnings. Both romantic oversimplifications miss the mark. Human life is somewhere in the complex middle. Every morally hopeful explanation of what it means to be human has a shadow side. The exhilaration of the ochre find at Blambos Cave, which reminds us of the promise of our symbolic species, for instance, for things like self-reflection, is troubled by the cooked remains of a cannibal feast from the same region. The Pauline paradox, I do what I hate, is present throughout human history, as far back as we can know about it. As an example of the complex middle, consider the way we use reason itself, the hallmark of our species. We rightly recognize the capacity for objectivity as a distinctive feature of humanity. Yet it seems that the repetition of truth claims, even claims that are known to be false, have the effect of making them seem more truthful to those who receive them. The human brain favors statements that have already been processed, which can create a situation in which groups large and small become blinded by falsehoods, as can be seen in political, cultural, and religious echo chambers. Such thinking shortcuts, also known as cognitive biases, tend to limit our openness to new ways of thinking, even when our standard ways of thinking are absurd. Consider the enthusiastic embrace of Nazism by so many ordinary German citizens in the 1930s, or the popularization of various historical myths, such as the flat earth myth, that have long been debunked but persist nonetheless. And yet this very tendency is one that also makes us capable of trusting all kinds of genuine sources of knowledge upon which we rely, as Jeremy reminded us, for 99% of the information that we have and of the truths that we know and are able to reason about. What can lead in some cases to the spread of ideologies like social Darwinism is also essential to knowing the truth and living in a flourishing society. When you guys remember that picture, right? When I got up this morning, my daughter's using WhatsApp to communicate with us. And my wife had a shout out to her. Alrighty, Baglows, because my son is also in Europe. Check in, please. One assurance is that my traveling treasures are alive and well. And Margaret responded by saying, just got back from Auschwitz-Birkenau. Say a prayer for me, please. It's been a hard day. Yeah. Consider then the evil of racial or ethnic discrimination. Research seems to show that we have a natural tendency to make distinctions between us and them. Them referring to human beings that are different than us. As social animals that both evolved and live in groups, we have an innate tendency to favor members of the in-group and to be less inclined toward trusting members of out-groups. Similar behaviors have been detected in other primates, which indicates that the roots of out-group bias go far back into our evolutionary history. And yet the same tendency is also at the root of our ability to bond into groups, to offer mutual support to each other within them. We are without a doubt highly social and cooperative, more than any other species, and yet our group bonding nature also makes us cohesive in assaults upon others. Innocent blood, spilt over differences of skin color, culture, and religion, runs like a river through human history. In these and many other cases, inclinations toward good and evil actions seem to go hand in hand. How do we explain the dividing line between good and evil that, as Alexander Solzhenitsyn incisively observed, runs through every human heart? Here, modern science can only take us so far, and I think offers explanations that are often misleading. Thankfully, St. Thomas Aquinas was acutely perceptive about the ambivalent directionality of human inclinations and evaluated them from a philosophical perspective that is capacious enough to welcome the new knowledge that modern science provides us. As we saw on Monday, one of the most controversial positions of Thomas in his day, that is the one directly condemned by the Archbishop of Paris on the 3rd anniversary of Thomas's death, was that in human beings there is only one substantial form, the intellectual soul. As Dennis Turner puts it, for Thomas, one and only one soul runs all the way down through my animal and vegetative life, just as my vegetative and animal lives run all the way through and up into my intellectual life. While rational, we are wholly animals and not partly animals. Of course, the only reason we talk about morality at all is because, unlike non-rational animals, we do animal things for reasons and not simply because of inclinations. We can speak of good and bad reasons and thus good and bad actions. But animals we are, and this means that to understand animality is to begin to understand ourselves. To acknowledge that human animality is now much more brightly illuminated through fields such as cognitive and evolutionary psychology, which have expanded the range and accuracy of our vision of our animality, our understanding of how it works does not require substantially departing from Thomas's incredible insight. We are animals. Now, to the complex moral middle again. Animality bears all the potential, but also all the limitations of materiality. And here Thomas is also a die-hard realist. In our bodily composition, he speculated, sorry, my clicker's giving me a, whoop, there we go. Nature gave the best it was capable of providing. It produced a body with features that are useful for rational animals, like sense and touch. But then he makes a comparison, or an analogy, I should say. Just as a blacksmith might choose iron to make a knife for one set of reasons, iron is hard, it can be sharpened, it can be made very sharp, for example. The blacksmith might also regret that same material for other reasons, such as the tendency of iron to rust easily. In Thomas's own words, for we may note a twofold condition in any matter, one which the agent chooses and another which is not chosen by the agent and is a natural condition of matter. And so it is with human beings. We have the proper kind of biological makeup for a rational animal, but because of the very limitations of animality in the material world, that makeup cannot of itself provide us with everything needed to be the embodied image of God, which is the theological definition of what it means to be human. God is eternal and the source of perfect life. Our bodies are corruptible. We are naturally subject to sickness and aging and death. Our reason and freedom are constantly interacting with our animal instincts and inclinations, and those are not easy to harmonize with knowing the truth and doing the good. But Thomas would reject the conclusion from this that our animality makes us intrinsically evil. It makes us only what any biological process can produce, a creature that by nature pursues certain animal goods. The bad tendencies we discover in ourselves arise only in relation to the goods that we strive for by nature. But then Thomas also surprises us. He paradoxically affirms this ambivalent directionality as rooted in our animality, while at the same time offering a theology of original sin, precisely to explain why we find moral evil among human beings. If our animality is the best guide, or let's suppose for a second the only guide to our human nature, and our animality is ambiguous morally, we should not need a theology of original sin. This shows that for Thomas, It ought to be surprising to us that human beings sin. Being free, rational animals who also have ambiguous instincts and inclinations is for Thomas the beginning of the answer of the question, what is it to be human? But it is by no means the complete answer, nor would he consider it decisive that we now know that we receive those instincts and inclinations through evolution, through common descent from other animals. The issue of our metaphysical origin, rather than our material composition, or even our phylogeny, that we are created out of love freely by God who is love, tells Thomas decisively that moral evil is by no means natural to us, even if it is understandable by reference to our biological inheritance. For Thomas Aquinas, sin is entirely understandable by reference to our animality taken by itself, but it is a wounding of nature from the perspective of our being made in the image of God. Let me clarify that, what it means to say that sin is entirely understandable from one perspective but not from another. Sin is understandable because in this material universe, physical evil always accompanies every physical good. Our bodies and brains are no exception. At every step, we have to navigate that and discriminate between the pull of our inclinations by subjecting them to reason. Of course, sooner or later, we will stumble, or in my case, do a moral faceplant. From this perspective, sin is not only understandable, it can only seem inevitable. And yet, the Christian tradition has long held that special gifts beyond what biology can provide, what is other than nature, were offered to the first humans by God. The preternatural gifts, that is, the word, they actually praeter naturam, other than nature. There was supernatural force given to the soul, and so long as humans did not separate themselves from God through sin, the body would be preserved from all corruption and from death. Our bodily desires and emotions would be wholly subject to reason, and human beings fully alive, living in untainted goodness and happiness, and unbroken communion with God, would have been the result. These special endowments, the preternatural gifts, were graces given to perfect our biological state, lifting it beyond its ambiguous inclinations, making it correspond to God's ultimate intentions for us. Reason and freedom, the immaterial soul, made humans capable of communion with God, but not yet capable of living out that communion. These gifts were added to human nature so that God's loving desire for our unending happiness and divine friendship would be realized. Yet this was frustrated by sin. Hence, the drama of redemption becomes necessary due to the actualization of freedom in a way that goes astray from goodness. Thomas asserts that after the fall, the first humans reverted back to their biological heritage. He says, when man turned his back on God, he fell under the influence of his sensual bodily impulses. After the fall, he is likened to beasts that are led by the impulse of sensuality, a deviation from the law of reason. St. Thomas knows nothing about evolutions, genetics, paleoanthropology, or evolutionary psychology. But his words here have an eerie correspondence to those of the paleoanthropologist Ian Tattersall, who says that what we are by nature is the rational and the irrational constantly jostling each other. Reflecting upon this quote from St. Thomas, the Jesuit theologian Henri Rondet helps us see how the evil tendencies we find in ourselves are both natural from a scientific perspective, yet unnatural from the divine perspective. Man has been left to his nature, but it is precisely this that is the paradox and stumbling block. Death, suffering, ignorance, the revolt of the senses, all this is in fact natural, since man is made of flesh and spirit. But what is natural to an animal organism becomes unnatural for a soul made in the image of God. So the wound caused by original sin, our fallen state, is best understood as a spark that was snuffed by sin, a higher way of life that was lost. Thanks to sin, man was left unfinished and his ultimate destiny frustrated. God had gifts to give, but he was stopped. And like the wise and loving father in the parable of the prodigal son, He respected the freedom of his children and permitted them to go away. The fact that we are created in the image of God means that we are beings whose lives make no sense without community, being in genuine relationships with each other. Joseph Ratzinger, in his theology of original sin, talks about sin as the disturbance of relationships. Whenever I sin, I make myself the center of the universe, rejecting God and others. The first sin damaged the network of relationships at the very beginning of human history. The world of human community we all enter is marked by relational damage. In Ratzinger's interpretation, at the very moment that a person enters human existence, which is a good, he or she is confronted by a sin-damaged world. Each of us enters into a situation in which relationality has been hurt. Consequently, each person is, from the very start, damaged in relationships and does not engage in them as he or she ought. Sin pursues the human being, and he or she capitulates to it. Decades after this observation, as Pope Benedict XVI, he would complete this insight with the beautiful exception that proves the rule: the sinlessness of the Blessed Virgin Mary, preserved from all stain of sin from the moment of her conception. In explaining that dogma, he says, we all carry the drop of poison of thinking that standing all alone, raising ourselves to God's level, we will fulfill ourselves, finding real happiness. In his words, we call this drop of poison original sin. In sinning, every human being, quote, sets his sights on power with which he desires to take his own life autonomously in hand. And in doing so, he trusts in deceit rather than truth, and thereby sinks with his life into emptiness, into death. Close quote. But God's love and the love of others are gifts. Trying to sinfully stand on our own is to enslave ourselves, for the freedom we have must be lived with one another and for one another in order for it to be realized. Mary, on the other hand, shows us what freedom truly means, namely receiving one's life through unrestricted closeness to others. The person who turns to God does not become smaller but greater, Pope Benedict said. For through God and with God, he becomes great. He becomes divine. He becomes truly himself. The person who puts himself in God's hands does not distance himself from others, withdrawing into his private salvation. On the contrary, it is only then that his heart truly awakens and he becomes a sensitive, hence benevolent and open person. The closer a person is to God, the closer he is to people. We see this in Mary. The fact that she is totally with God is the reason why she is so close to human beings. Our Lady, Mother of Grace, pray for us. In the deepest sense, then, to the extent that we find the idea of sinlessness alien, how many of you have ever had that experience? You try to think about what it would be like to be sinless, and anybody raise your hand. And you're like, I don't even know what that would be like, how I would get out of bed, right? Without at least like having a negative thought about something that's going to happen that day or whatever it might be. But from the perspective we're developing here, to the extent that we find the idea of sinlessness alien, we do not really know what it is like to be human in the full theological sense. From that perspective, it's not enough to say that human beings are likely to sin due to our animality, and just to call that sad state of affairs natural, in the same sense that we would call genuine friendship, heroic sacrifice, or marital fidelity natural. We look at Christ and wonder, how can he be called truly human if he somehow only actualized human nature without sinning? But actually, we should reverse the question. How can we be called truly human when we pervasively and freely undermine love, truth, friendship, family, and God in our thoughts, words, and deeds? To us, Christ looks strange and far from what we are because he is not a sinner like us. But what makes him seem far from us is paradoxically his unobstructed closeness to us. We are divided and alienated from ourselves, from others, and from God through sin. He is not. He is not only the perfect image of God, but also the full realization of the human person as well. And so we come to see why it is in the manger of Bethlehem, not in Blambos cave, that we find out what it means to be truly human. In the Constitution on the Church in the Modern World, Gaudium et Spes, the Second Vatican Council identified Christ as the new Adam, the one who fully reveals man to himself and makes his supreme calling clear. Here's a quote from that document. He who is the image of the invisible God is himself the perfect man. To the sons of Adam he restores the divine likeness, which had been disfigured from the first sin onward. For by his incarnation, the Son of God has united himself in some fashion with every human being. He worked with human hands. He thought with a human mind, acted by human choice, and loved with a human heart. Born of the Virgin Mary, he has truly been made one of us, like us in all things except sin. In this short summary of the mystery of the Incarnation, we see the solution to the riddle of the paradox of human nature. Christ answers our moral fragility and ambiguous inclinations with perfect love, living out an ordinary human existence in a sinless way. He did not take up human nature as it existed before sin damaged human life with its specially endowed preternatural gifts. Instead, he assumed our fallen human nature in order to redeem it, to fill it with his grace, purifying it through the abundance of his love and his perfect obedience to the will of the Father. Knowledge of our human nature, therefore, full knowledge of our human nature, means to know Jesus Christ. The key phrase in the quote from Vatican II here is its assertion that Jesus loved with a human heart. In biblical symbolism, the heart represents the center of thinking, willing, and acting. With this in mind, the Church celebrates the Feast of the Sacred Heart of Jesus as a reminder of the pure love with which Jesus loved all human beings and united himself to us totally. In the revelation of Jesus Christ, the Word made flesh, even the holes in being created by sin and moral evil are met with mercy and with grace and the loving power that draws good out of evil. The author of the letter to the Hebrews captures this beautifully. Christ, he tells us, has become our merciful and faithful high priest, precisely by loving us in the midst of his own human suffering and temptations. Because he himself was tested through what he suffered, he is able to help those who are being tested. Recognizing that Jesus faced the same temptations we face, he also tells us that this was necessary for our sake. For we do not have a high priest who has been unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but one who has similarly been tested in every way, yet without sin. So let us confidently approach the throne of grace to receive mercy and to find grace for timely help. Jesus reversed the disobedience of sin by persevering through suffering and temptation in obedience to his Father. And so, as the letter to Hebrews also says, became the source of eternal salvation to all those who obey him. Sorry. St. Paul expresses this mystery of our salvation in a single verse in the second letter to the Corinthians. He tells us in chapter 8, verse 9, "He who was rich became poor for our sake, so that we might become rich through his poverty." This marvelous exchange was celebrated by the fathers of the church. The perfect divine Son, grappling with and mastering our imperfect nature, making himself subject to its weakness without ever being overcome by it, so that he could bring us into a new kind of life. Echoing the letter to the Hebrews, the 4th century bishop and theologian, St. Gregory of Nazianzus, depicts this mystery as the Son of God coming to know by direct experience the suffering caused by temptation and weakness, which is the suffering of our animal nature. In the form of a slave, he, the Word, descends to his fellow slaves and takes upon himself an alien form, bearing me and all mine in himself, so that in himself he may consume the bad as fire consumes the wax, or as the sun the mists of the earth, and that I might partake of his divine nature by the blending. Thus he honors obedience by his action and experiences it by his passion. He probes our obedience, and through his inventive love, he measures everything by his own sufferings. Thus, he can learn from his experience what we experience, how much is demanded from us and how much we are excused. He weighs our weakness according to what he suffered. So Christ experiences firsthand the tensions and sufferings of being human. But he does not only experience the human condition firsthand, he also lives it with unwavering moral goodness and obedience to the will of the Father. And in doing so, shows us the path forward to what is the only authentically human existence as creatures made in the image and likeness of God. The full realization of human nature, therefore, comes from living and loving as Christ did, from allowing our own lives to be refashioned into the image of Christ, who is the perfect image of God. The human being who shows us the real meaning of life and the path to unending happiness, then, is not the one at the beginning of human history, but the one who appears in the fullness of time. Not the first Adam, but the last. Now, it's easy to misunderstand this important Christian truth, especially because the fullest expression of Jesus' humanity comes in the context of his painful death. What makes Christ the fulfillment of our humanity, the true Adam, is not the grisliness of his death, but the perfection of his love, which can be seen in his obedience to the Father and in his love for all human beings. This love is what makes his sacrifice to God perfect and complete. As St. Augustine observes in The City of God, a true sacrifice is an act done for the purpose of clinging to God in a holy fellowship, directed to that final good which makes possible our true happiness. St. Ignatius of Antioch saw in his own martyrdom a chance to perfect his love and to perfect his humanity, to become fully a human being. But it is in living the Christian life, which always involves relentlessly clinging to God and loving one's neighbor, that the process of becoming fully a human being is possible for each and every one of us. The Christian life is the adventure in which the image of God is gradually perfected in all who believe. Okay, one moment. I'm going to skip to the end here because I want to leave some time for any questions you might have. So the love and holiness that we see in Christ and Mary, in the example of St. Ignatius of Antioch, that is a theme that runs through the lives of all holy men and women, the great communion of saints whom the Church holds up for us as examples and as our intercessors. As we began by examining the human inclination toward outgroup bias, which, when unchecked, turns into nightmarish forms of violence against outsiders, let us now consider a saint who is the complete antithesis of outgroup bias, who reveals how radically open our animality is to redemption and to grace. One of the most horrific embodiments of violence in human history is racial slavery. The capture, bondage, and forced labor of Africans is a dark phase in the history of the colonization of the Americas. For 2.5 centuries, until 1852, the slave trade was active. It is estimated that about 125,000 Africans entered the port city of Cartagena, Colombia, in chains between 1595 and 1640. Each ship would carry 400 to 500 slaves, and it was not uncommon for a third of those to die on the 2-month voyage. For the rest, the cruelty of forced labor awaited. It would have been a hopeless situation were it not for heroic Christians like St. Peter Claver. Claver was born to a wealthy family in Catalonia, Spain. He was the son of the mayor of his town. During his university studies, he encountered the Society of Jesus and joined them, and shortly thereafter encountered a lay brother who helped him realize a call from the Lord to go to the New World. In 1611, he arrived in Cartagena and was ordained a priest in 1616. There he became an assistant to Father Alonso de Sandoval, who first began the outreach to African slaves. Then he began his own work, becoming, as he would refer to himself, a slave to the slaves. Over 35 years, he never missed the arrival of a ship. He would go out by boat, board the ships, bathe the slaves in perfumed water, and give them clean water to drink. he would carry gifts of food and would care for them. Over the years, he would travel widely to visit those whom he had once cared for on the ships and continue his ministry to them. In response, over 300 slaves would be baptized by his hands. The lengths to which Peter Claver would go to care for the slaves showed a depth of love that was truly supernatural, far surpassing any kind of natural empathy or compassion. Claver would wipe the sweat from the faces of the slaves with his own handkerchief. Moreover, he would often clothe the sick and diseased in his own cloak. As some of his interpreters witnessed, the cloak had to be washed up to 7 times a day from the stink and filth which it had accumulated. It was routine for Claver to console his fellow man by joyfully undertaking practices which were considered extremely repugnant to most. As one eyewitness notes, most admirable was that he not only cleansed these plague-ridden ulcers with the 2 handkerchiefs he kept for that, but did not hesitate to press his lips to them. He plainly saw Christ in the least of his brethren. It may be a natural inclination from one perspective for human beings to fear and distrust those who are different, and when hardened into evil choices and habits, whole cultures are corrupted. What we see in St. Peter Claver is the new natural, the recognition of all human beings as brothers made possible by the grace of God given to us in Christ. As the words of St. Paul reveal, that new natural involves replacing bias with belonging. There is neither Jew nor Greek. There is neither slave nor free person. There is not male nor female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. This is not unique to St. Peter Claver nor St. Paul. It is at the heart of the new reality of human life that radiates from the Sacred Heart of Christ. From the beginning of Christianity, we see a new standard dawning in the world. The conviction that ethnicity, culture, and color do not make anyone inferior nor worthy of maltreatment, slavery, or death, and that love must extend beyond the boundaries created by family and tribe. In the words of the sociologist Rodney Stark in his study of the rise of Christianity, from its origins as a tiny movement in Palestine to becoming the majority religion of the Roman Empire, what Christianity gave to its converts was nothing less than their humanity. In this sense, virtue was its own reward. The work of God in fashioning his image postponed by sin has been definitively accomplished in Christ, who invites all human beings to freely join him in this new complete way of being human, the way God intended. The Christian claim is that the mystery of redemption has remade the universe and the human race. And it has revealed where the true origin of humanity is to be discovered, not in the relics of prehistory, not in the advent of language and symbolism, but in the man who showed us what it means to be truly human, Jesus, the new Adam. Thank you. I'm sorry if I was dragging there a little bit. I'm starting to lose my voice, as you can hear.
So we have
Any
time
questions?
for questions.
Could you put that first image that you had with the 2 apes back up? I want to connect a little science with what you've been talking about here that I think is relevant and interesting. Yeah. So these were the 2 images you started off with, and I think you can look at one and say love and the other one and say hate. Or at least that's one way of interpreting, this is hate and that's love over there. And that hate is the source of sin and that love is the source of goodness and all that kind of stuff. But one of the interesting things that moral psychological research is showing us more and more is that these are the same thing.
Yeah.
That the greatest acts of evil are not done out of hate. The greatest acts of evil are done out of love. The reason why I kill you and I kill your tribe is not because I hate you in your tribe. It's because I love my tribe. And I think you're a threat to my tribe. And so even love is corrupted human love,
Right.
is corrupted by sin, original sin, however you want to talk about
Sure.
it. But even that needs to be perfected. It needs to be purified because, the answer is not love. The answer is love that somehow gets purified or gets perfected, because in its natural state, love can lead you to doing the left hand image just as much as the right hand image.
Right. There's two books by C.S. Lewis that I think is wonderful to read in tandem. One of them is called The Four Loves, and the other one is called The Great Divorce. And reading the two together, well, The Four Loves kind of refers to the classic kinds of love that the Greeks talked about, right? And then holds agape, or charity, right? And shows how charity tames these other loves, right? And then The Great Divorce actually shows you people who are given the opportunity to leave hell and go to heaven. But in many cases, they decide to go back to hell, right? And oftentimes, it's their love that sends them back to hell. Like a woman goes, and she's upset that her brother comes out to meet her and not her son, who died young. And as their dialogue goes on, you realize that this mother ruined her family, their domestic happiness, by just focusing on the child that was lost. The child that was lost, always bringing him up, always doing these things. You know what I mean? Never paying attention to her other children. Her love, this motherly love, was not enough. It had to be animated by charity. Yeah. So, anyway, yeah, and you never find out what happens to her, but the author's guide through C.S. Lewis's guide through heaven tells him that sometimes he's seen mothers demanding that they be given their children to go back to hell with them. Yeah. So, right. Great point. Oh, sorry.
No,
I didn't
good.
realize you had the microphone there.
So a question in regards to original sin, just clarification. Please correct me if I'm wrong. So what I'm interpreting what you're saying here is that we need to, I guess, change the way we view original sin, less of looking at it as this event with a couple that then led to all humanity suffering, like through one man everybody fell, but rather looking at it as more of a human event that led to humanity falling as a whole. If that's the case, would you mind just kind of putting that in the dialogue with what most people tend to believe, right? Like the whole idea of one man sinning, therefore one man saving, and all that. How do we put what you're proposing, the development of the doctrine of original sin, in the dialogue with like the theological norm that people have lived with?
Mm-hmm. Sure. Well, I think that, so for a lot of people, it's almost like they've got an idea or anxiety in their minds that this has to happen a particular kind of way, and that there can be no variation from that. And I'd like to see that anxiety be relieved, because I think what it does is it actually masks or obscures what original sin is. It's not looking deeply at the various dynamics that are involved here, nor does it deal with the most important issue of original sin, which is my life and experience, right? And what it means to be redeemed. So that's the most important thing to me. Also, it tends to be the place where people have a problem with modern science, right? Genetics seems to tell us that two human beings at the beginning of the human race just doesn't work, as Father Nicanor Austriaco makes clear in his book Thomistic Evolution. That, well, I know what he's saying now, but in his book. This is not, so this is a situation where we talk about like maybe 2,000, 3,000 breeding pairs is probably what we need for the genetic diversity that we have today. So how do we square that, right? Is something that theologians need to think about. As Matt said the other day, certainly somewhere the network of relationships got damaged, right? So is that, and that would have to be personal fault, right? For it to be truly what we call original sin. But we shouldn't be so, I think, worried, concerned, that somehow, if not saying it exactly the way it's always been said, is going to somehow jettison everything that we believe. It's not. The Axe apologist is wrong about that. Right? We don't have any need to prove original sin to ourselves. I'm proof of original sin to myself, right now.
Cool. Awesome. Thank you.
Carl. Oh, wait, I'm sorry.
I'm coming.
Okay, this is in all seriousness. One of the issues we have at our school is a large group or percentage of people that are very fundamentalist in their beliefs of the evolution of humanity. And we have a significant percentage of our children that the ultimate destination is to go to the Creation Museum and the Ark. With people of this mindset, you know, what would be your advice for trying to dispel this as their ultimate proof of, I guess, Christ or Jesus or the Bible or whatever they're thinking?
That depends. I mean, and it goes all the way down, right? So there's all kinds of questions you could ask. First of all, are they Catholic kids?
Yes, they are.
Catholic kids, yeah.
The majority of our school are Catholic.
So I think demonstrating them the openness that the church is, like the popes have shown toward evolution, is good. Also, helping them understand the distinction between, say, how we became what we are and why we became what we are. The difference between God creating us, right, causing all things to be right at this moment and exist right now, and through every moment that there's been moments, right? Versus, say, God, versus the scientific process, which describes how we are able to be causes of each other, right? Our cooperation with God, who is so good that he not only causes us, but he causes us to be causes of each other in a different way that's not in competition with that main way. I think it takes going that route. I think it means showing them that they experience chance and randomness in their own lives, and yet they believe in God, right? Consequently, a process that involves chance is not contrary to divine providence, but chance can actually be a tool of divine providence to bring about God's plan. There's a whole number of ways you could do that, and I can share actually with you if you would like some resources.
You know what we do, but some of the group we're talking about don't really even recognize the current openness. Beliefs.
Okay, that might be a little bit harder. See,
I mean, when I say fundamentalist, we're
right. Yeah, Jeremy. Oh, wait, or Carl, actually. I'm sorry, Jeremy. I kept asking Carl or inviting Carl to say something all through Disputatio, and he was usually quiet, so I feel like I should. It's going to be awesome.
No, I was just wondering if you could recommend any further materials as far as if we wanted to read some more on this notion. Like you referenced earlier, Humani Generis and the idea of one set of first parents, and
Right.
like on one hand, the Pope seems like he's going all in on that, but the way he words it is just careful enough that he doesn't say like this is the only way you can interpret this. So
Right.
if we wanted to read some more about that or sort of try to understand possible interpretations, is there anything you would point us to?
Sure, 1 second. So I would particularly, here's Humani Generis. And I think, highlighted here in red some important things to note about what he's saying. First of all, the data about human origins at the time, 70 years ago, is conjectural opinion. I mean, really, this is, not fully developed science in the way it is today. It's becoming the consensus, but there's a lot of different opinions about how it came about. You've got the multi-regional hypothesis, right? So on. He says it's no way apparent how the idea of many parents can be reconciled with that which the sources of revealed truth propose with regard to original sin, right? So, not apparent how it can be reconciled. That's not the same thing as saying the idea of two first parents is part of the dogma of original sin. Then it would require the obedience of faith, right? So this requires a religious submission of mind and will. It is not infallible teaching. And we've been given some direction by the magisterium on how to deal with, right, non-definitive teaching. In the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith document, Donum Veritatis, number 24, it actually tells us, when it comes to the question of interventions in the prudential order, note the Pope is telling us, right, we can't embrace this. It doesn't seem apparent. He's cautioning us, right? He doesn't want the idea of original sin to be jettisoned, because what seems to be logically required of that is jettisoned first by science. That's what he's worried about, right? And at the time, I think that was a very prudent concern, right? Bishops and their advisors have not always taken into immediate consideration every aspect of the entire complexity of a question, right? And it goes on to say, this doesn't mean that the magisterium is always wrong. And he says more, or rather it says more, Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. In fact, the theologian who cannot pursue his discipline well without a certain competence in history is aware of the filtering which occurs with the passage of time, right? Another sentence down. The theologian knows that some judgments of the magisterium could be justified at the time in which they were made. Because while the pronouncements contained true assertions and others which were not sure, both types were inextricably connected. Only time has permitted discernment, and after deeper study, the attainment of true doctrinal progress. Now, this was produced under Joseph Ratzinger while he was prefect of the CDF. In a commentary on the document itself, he gives us more detail about what number 24 means. The text also presents the various forms of binding authority which correspond to the grades of the magisterium. It states, perhaps for the first time with such candor, that there are magisterial decisions which cannot be the final word on a given matter as such, but, despite the permanent value of their principles, are chiefly also a signal for pastoral prudence, a sort of provisional policy. Their kernel remains valid, but the particulars determined by circumstances can stand in need of correction. He gives a couple of examples. Statements of the popes regarding freedom of religion and the anti-modernist decisions of the then Biblical Commission. With respect to particular aspects of their content, they were superseded after having fulfilled their pastoral function in the situation of their time. So, we have a good guide here to how to deal with this. As things progress, theologians are called to begin to think precisely about these areas and ask the question, how can we think about these in such a way that we bring harmony between faith and new discoveries, right? Rather than hold off the new discoveries like this in order, you know what I mean, in order to keep sort of to the way it had been understood in previous generations. It's called the development of doctrine, right? And oftentimes it goes through theology. Right? It's precisely through, Vatican II says, the contemplation of believers that we have doctrinal progress. So anyway, that might be helpful. Yeah. Jeremy.
I have three suggestions. Well,
Unless you tell me four, man, I'm going like this.
I'm blocking it out.
Yeah.
Well, no, just a couple of thoughts on these recent exchanges, and the original thing that I was going to say suggest in relation to the issue about the young people who want to go to the Young Earth Creation Museum or whatever. It strikes me that a lot of times the problem there is actually less theoretical, although I agree with all the points that you made about, that there's no problem thinking about God and an evolutionary world order if you have any sense at all of second causality. But it seems to me a lot of times the issues are really have to do with particular conception of the way the Bible works.
Yeah.
And that a fear so it's really a problem not for thinking about God so much as thinking about how the Bible can be true.
Yeah.
And so it may be useful to kind of try and hit it from that side too and say, well, that's not actually really the way Catholics read the Bible. That's a very modern fundamentalist way of reading the Bible, as if it has to have the same kind of meaning structure as an engineering textbook. Otherwise, it's not meaningful and it can't be true. And so that may be a useful, that's what I would suggest there. I think the real root hang-up is about reading the Bible.
When we do Institute Days, that's the talk I give most often, which
Right.
is about the Bible and how to understand the Bible in relation to creation, and the first creation account in particular. So anyway, I can give you a resource on that too, both on evolution and some misconceptions by believers, and also something on Scripture.
Right. So I was thinking in relation to this, I mean, you made the point, so in relation to this last question too, you made the point that Paul really gets back to original sin by thinking about the universal significance of Christ as the new Adam.
Right.
And so kind of reads back the significance of the first Adam in light of the second Adam. And that just, in a way, goes to the point that, his way of thinking about original sin was an answer to a question about the universal salvific significance of Christ.
Right.
And what I wanted to suggest is that, when we're thinking about this, and it's related to the issue that you're raising about the development of doctrine, the doctrines are answers to questions, and they get worked out in relation to the particular ways the questions are posed. So the way we tend to formulate original sin owes a lot to Augustine, who really was thinking about the problem of, well, why do we baptize infants with a baptism that's for the remission of sins and that is necessary for salvation? And that kind of required him to postulate some kind of original fault. But it seems like a lot of the ways that he was thinking about that need to be re-examined or rethought as well. So it's just really the suggestion is just complementary to what you're suggesting in terms of thinking about the history of why these doctrines came to be articulated in the particular ways that they are. Yeah. And I think that just opens up exactly what you were suggesting so helpfully, that there is something empirical about the brokenness that we all inherit and are somehow responsible for that's analogously sinful. Anyway, that was it.
Yeah,
Really
that's great. And I think that in that regard, it's a great opportunity to show your students that religion, theology, is not a dead science. It's developing too. We are, the Second Vatican Council said, progressing in our understanding of the faith revealed once for all. And so that requires being able to look at things from different perspectives and take in new knowledge, and that's how. So science doesn't simply stimulate theological reflection. It also stimulates at times the development of doctrine. And that's not a bad thing. In fact, I'm helping to direct a dissertation on how scientific progress affects the development of doctrine for a student at CUA. It's a great opportunity for things to move forward. Now, we have to do that cautiously, right? There has to be a way in which we that we recognize and affirm everything that is true and that has been defined by the church, including about original sin. So, I'm not saying this, I'm not breaking my oath of fidelity that I took at Notre Dame Seminary when I talk about these things. I actually have it at the forefront of my mind. But a faithful mind is also a mind that creatively engages and tries to reflect on things in such a way that it can be broken open ever anew in light of what we know. Sister.
I'd like to thank you for emphasizing that the evolution of human beings should be taught in the high school curriculum, because I think it's very important to understand that, to lead away from the misconceptions that we have. Number one, that being the picture you showed there of the Killer Ape. That's a Hollywoodized version of a find, but by Raymond Dart in 1922,
Right.
where he thought, that this hyena bone was used by the apes to kill one another.
Right.
A gross misconception. And then on the part of the Bible, so many people believe the Bible in a literal way because they haven't either taken courses or been taught that this is not the way you interpret the Bible, and it's not the teaching of the church on the interpretation of the Bible. I had one parent call me a heretic because I was teaching the contextual approach to the Bible.
Yeah. All right, thank you. Actually, we were supposed to take a break a while back. I think it might have been as much as 15 minutes ago. For that, I am very sorry.